blessed Redeemer, living Word. Stand and sing this with Callie as she plays. Jesus, name above all names, beautiful Savior, glorious Lord, Emmanuel, God is with us, blessed Redeemer, living
I once read a quote that was like this: God's plans for you aren't just for pie in the sky when you die. It's also for steak on your plate while you wait. So, that's a little oversimplification of what it is here on the planet, but the fact of the matter is God has a plan for you and for me. And that brings us to our text this morning, because God had a plan for this young man named Joseph. He had a great plan for Joseph. God gave Joseph a couple of dreams that helped Joseph realize God's plan one day to make him into a great man. He was a very instrumental person in the Old Testament. Joseph shared these dreams with his family. Didn't go over too well. Remember the story a few weeks ago? He told them of his dream where his brothers' sheaves in the field would bow down to him, and he told another dream about how the 11 stars and the sun and the moon, that was representing his brothers and father and mother, how they would bow down to him. They didn't like that. None of them liked that. Joseph had no clue what that meant exactly, but he was excited to know that God had a purpose for his life. I want you to notice something about the book of Genesis. It covers a lot of territory. A lot of subjects in there. There are 50 chapters to that book. Joseph and his dreams are introduced in chapter 37. That means the last 13 chapters of Genesis, or about a quarter of the book, was dedicated to Joseph's life. Nobody else in Genesis got this amount of pages. Nobody got that attention. Noah didn't. Abraham didn't. Jacob didn't. So the question is why? Why would God put so much emphasis on this guy named Joseph? Why would he spend so much ink and paper so we would have it thousands of years later about the story of Joseph? Well, Joseph received all this attention, I believe, because he was a pivotal character in the story in the history of Israel. It was because of Joseph that his family, you remember the story, that what's going to happen, we're going to see later in a couple more weeks. His family moved to Egypt to escape the famine. And it was because of Joseph that they were given this isolated section of Egypt to live in. It's called Goshen. You've heard the phrase, land of Goshen. Goshen is where the Israelites lived. It was an isolated, out-of-the-way location for Israel, the whole nation, to raise their flocks and herds. It was almost as if God had placed them there safely behind Egypt's walls and Egypt's power. Nobody else could attack them. They were safe. They were secure for years and years and years. No government interfered with them. No other religion influenced them. And as it was in that secluded and protected land, that God grew the people of Israel into this mighty nation, this potential army of over about 1 million people who would soon go into the promised land. It was all God's plan. And he used Joseph to make it happen. Now, why would it matter whether we understood why God used Joseph to shape the destiny of Israel? Well, here's why I tell you the reason. There's some people out there who would warp this story to their own agenda. I know you think that's shocking. But some people change this story to fit their agenda, to fit their ideas. It's called the prosperity gospel. And here's what that says. They teach their followers that if you are spiritual enough, if you have enough faith, here's what God will do. He will supply all your needs, and you'll become healthy, wealthy, and wise beyond all your imagination if you'll just do it that way. The flip side of that teaching is a problem. That if you're not spiritual enough, you'll be sickly, poor, and not too bright. It's the opposite of healthy, wealthy, and wise. So here's the problem. The Jews of Jesus' day had fallen into that trap. They believed that the wealth was a reward that God gave to faithful people, And that if a person was wealthy, they obviously had done something right with God. In God's eyes, you've done well, you're wealthy. And so that's what the Jews of that day believed. And so when Jesus tells his followers this, it's easier to go through the eye of a camel to go through the eye of a needle, than for the rich to enter to heaven. They were aghast. They couldn't believe it. What are you talking about? It's impossible. How in the world, if the rich people can't get into heaven, who in the world is going to go to heaven? And so Jesus had to combat that. We combat that same thing today. Prosperity preachers feed on that mindset. They basically teach their audiences that God is some kind of celestial slot machine. All you have to do, they say, is push the right buttons, pull the right levers, and God will pour out so many earthly blessings upon you that your head will spin. Often, though, the buttons they encourage you to push are the buttons on your phone to dial in and give a donation to their ministry. The fact is, God has a plan for your life. It's not about us using God to get what we want. Listen, we cannot manipulate God. Don't waste your time. God says He has a plan for your life. It's not about Him giving you an earthly estate or a Maserati or a huge swimming pool in your backyard. Nothing wrong with those things if you can afford it. But when God says He has a plan for your life, that's not what He's offering. What He's offering you is a chance to be honored by Him, a chance to be His partner in ministry. And so that's what He offers to Joseph. When God says He has a plan for you, He's saying He has a plan that makes you useful. Do you realize there are a lot of Christians walking around who are not useful whatsoever to the kingdom of God? They're going through the routines, they're doing their habits, they're doing their process, but they're not useful to God's kingdom. God wants all of us to be useful. He's going to give you meaning to life. He's going to give you a reason to live and a reason to exist. And so just like He had a plan for Joseph, God has a plan for your life too. Now, that's the good news. God has something in store for every single believer. The bad news is this. Sometimes in order for you and I to be useful to God, God might have to take us through some time of training. A time to shave off the rough edges and hone our attitudes to His purposes. And so in comes the story of Joseph. God no sooner gives Joseph his dreams and his brothers get him off by himself, beat the tar out of him and throw him in a pit. And then they sell him as a slave. And so for the next 11 years, Joseph was a slave, and for 2 more years he was in prison. Another 11 years before he ever sees his father again. He didn't think he would ever see his father again. And you say, well, that's not right. That's not fair. That shouldn't have happened. You're probably right, but it did. Maybe you're saying that about something in your life. That's not fair that happened to me. That shouldn't have happened to me. That's not right. Maybe it wasn't, but it happened. And you've got to learn to deal with it. And I have to learn to deal with those things. So where was God in the middle of all this? Genesis 39:2 says this, the Lord was with Joseph and he became a successful man. Genesis 39:5, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake because Joseph was there. Genesis 39:21, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Every single place Joseph was, God was right there with him. God's hand was guiding him. Everything that Joseph had to endure was all part of God's plan. He was training this young man, this boy, this young man, this young adult into becoming a great leader. Now, maybe you feel like Joseph. Maybe you feel like Joseph. Forsaken. Maybe you feel forsaken like Joseph. It tells us there in chapter 39, verse 20, that Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. So, picking up our story from last week, Joseph was thrown in jail because he warded off advances from Mrs. Potiphar. She didn't like it. She accused him of raping her, and Potiphar throws him in jail. So, there's where Joseph is. He'd been in the pit, he'd been on the slave block, been in charge of Potiphar's house. Now he's thrown into prison. Alone in an Egyptian dungeon, left to die, all by himself in jail. Almost sounds like a Johnny Cash song, doesn't it? All by himself, nobody there. And so maybe you're lonely. Maybe you're broken or abandoned. Maybe you feel forsaken with everybody leaving you. No spouse, no one to date, no family. And you seem like you have nowhere to turn, nobody to talk to. You feel forsaken. And Joseph was waiting on God to reveal his purpose and show him why he had to go through this. You know, a ship doesn't know if it's seaworthy until it goes through some storms and figures out it can float. A soldier goes through basic training so he'll be ready for battle. How will you and I know our faith until it's tested? It's tested. A.W. Tozer talks about the relationship between a nail and a hammer. You ever thought about those two relationships? To the nail, it feels like he's constantly being beaten up, right? The hammer's beating him all the time. But if you look at both the nail and the hammer as a tool used by the master, you quickly see that the nail is used to hold things together, but it has to go through some pain to do it. The end result is to please the master by doing the purpose for which you were intended. I don't know what you're going to go through or what you've already been through, but God does. God knows exactly where you are. And He uses those things that we go through to shape us, to make us who we need to be, to accomplish what we're supposed to do. And the only one who can deal with me is me and God. Let's put those together. I can go over here and I can have a pity party, and I can think nobody loves me, I'm forsaken, I'm abandoned, and go into deep, dark depression. Or I can trust God and say, God, I trust what you're doing. I don't understand what you're doing, but I trust what you're doing. God's with you. Though I go through the valley of the shadow of death, you're right there with me. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter what you're going through. God is with you. Maybe you feel like Joseph. Secondly, you're on hold. Maybe you feel like you're on hold. Chapter 40, verses 1 through 8 tells us a little bit about this story. It came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, they offended their lord, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, and the chief butler and the chief baker, and so he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while. And then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream. Here we go again, another dream. Joseph is about to hear the dreams. Both of them, each man's dream in one night, each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were kind of sad. Verse 7 says, so he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in the custody of his Lord's house, saying, why do you look so sad today? And they said to him, we each had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And so here's what Joseph said. Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. Tell me your dream. They didn't know what to do. They had these weird dreams. We don't have time to go into all their dreams. But they had some dreams. Nobody could figure out what it was. Joseph says, if you'll tell them to me, God can interpret them for me. Now, here's where Joseph is. He's on hold. One of my favorite things to do in the world is to wait. I love waiting on a doctor who didn't take logistics in medical school. They don't know how to keep up, don't know the timing. I love waiting in traffic as people rubberneck to slow down on the interstate to look at something that happened over there and shut the whole interstate down at Paper Mill Road. I love to do that. I love waiting on hold on the phone for someone who cannot fix my problem after I've gone through that whole process. I love to wait. No, I don't. But for 2 years, Joseph languished in jail, and those 2 years were neither exciting or eventful. We don't have any details of it. 2 years, what's going on? They represented a long, dull, monotonous, unspectacular, slow-moving grind, month after month of nothing. That's like what it's like when you're in a period of waiting. Nothing's happening. Wait, wait, wait. But on the other hand, it only seems like nothing is happening. In reality, a lot is happening. Events are occurring apart from our involvements, and we are being strengthened and established and perfected and being shaped for greatness just like Joseph. Every person God uses greatly must go through waiting. Abraham had to wait for the birth of Isaac. Moses didn't lead the Exodus until he was 80 years old. Elijah waited and waited and waited beside the brook. Esther waited until God's timing was perfect. Noah waited 120 years for rain. that list doesn't end. I could go on and on and on. But God's always working while his people are waiting. And Joseph is being shaped for a significant future. Maybe some disease has taken hold of you and you're waiting for some answers. Maybe you've lost someone you dearly love and you're waiting for the grief to just be over. Maybe you're waiting by the phone to hear about that perfect job that you think you're going to get, Maybe you're being in a holding pattern, hoping to soon zoom off the runway into another area of your life. You know what God does? He works in the waiting. God is involved in the waiting room. Listen to Psalm 27:14. Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage. He shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Joseph didn't, but he could have written this psalm, 37 verse 7. Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who brings wicked schemes to pass. Joseph could have written that. Maybe you feel like Joseph. Thirdly, by being distressed. You're just distressed. Chapter 40, verse 23 says this one simple sentence. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. What do you mean remember him? Well, look up in chapter 40, verse 14. Joseph has told them their dreams, and here's what he says. But remember me when it's well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and I also have done nothing here that they should put me in the dungeon. Joseph said, hey, I've told you your dream, and when you get to Pharaoh and you tell him what's going on, don't forget about little old me. What'd they do? They forgot about him. One of them lost his head. He couldn't remember him, but the other one went before Pharaoh, but he forgot to tell about Joseph. Distress means this: suffering from anxiety, sorrow, or pain. Suffering from anxiety and sorrow or pain. You know, Joseph had to deal with all three of those. Maybe you can't help but feel anxious over your kids, or over your job, or your health. Maybe you seem afflicted and distracted and tormented. If anybody suffered in the Bible, one of them was Joseph. Up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. He couldn't figure out what was going on. And so when his external circumstances seemed almost unbearable, apparently his internal conditions were being refined into godliness. Don't miss that. When your external circumstances don't seem so good, what's going on the inside? What's going on the inside? What we see here is his endurance of afflictions with the eyes of God. And so throughout the rest of Joseph's life, from age 30 to age 110 when he died, we will not hear a word of resentment on his heart or his lips. Not a word of blame from Joseph against his brothers who sold him. Not a word of bitterness against Potiphar's wife. Not a word of rebuke against the butler who had forgotten him. He didn't do any of that. Joseph was eventually in a position to get even with all of them. Right? Prime Minister of Egypt, what he's going to become, but he didn't do that. There was a little boy visiting his grandmother. He began telling his grandmother how everything was going wrong. I'm not doing good in school. Nobody likes me. I'm being picked on. I don't feel good, and went through all this stuff. Well, all this time he's telling this story, his grandmother is baking a cake. She's mixing it all up and baking a cake. And so she says to the little boy, as he's telling the story, here, have some cooking oil. Drink some of this. And he says, yuck, Grandma, I don't want that. She says, well, how about a couple of raw eggs? Let me fix you a couple of those. That'll make you feel better. Gross. Gross, Grandma. I don't want to taste those either. Well, how would you like a spoonful of flour, maybe a spoonful of baking soda? Grandma, those are all yucky. I don't want any of those. And here's what she said. I guess they are. In fact, all those things seem bad by themselves. But when you mix them all together in the right way, they make a wonderfully delicious cake like I'm making for you. God works in our lives the same way. There's parts of your life that you haven't liked. There's things that have happened to you that have been yucky and gross. But God has plans for you. And some things in your life may seem like that. But God is mixing those things to shape you in the background, God was doing something amazing. Look in chapter 41, verse number 14. 41:14. Here's where the plot is. We don't have time to read about Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh has some dreams, just like we all have dreams. Pharaoh had some dreams. In chapter 41, verse 1 through 13, and in chapter 14, here's what happens. Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And here's what he did. He shaved, changed his clothing, and then came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that you can interpret and understand a dream. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it's not me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, here's his dream. I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I have ever seen in the land of Egypt. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. And when they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. So I awoke. Verse 22. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, like grain heads, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads with withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, the wise men, but there was no one who could explain it to me. I need your help, Joseph. I've heard that you could do this. The guy finally remembers, oh, there's a guy in jail who interpreted my dream. Let's talk to Joseph. And so nobody could understand what was going on with Pharaoh's dream. Now I want you to note this. This is the 3rd time we see dreams, and Joseph right in the middle of them. The one he interpreted in jail came true. So he comes before the king of Egypt to see if he can help. Look at verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 heads are 7 years. And the dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years. The 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. And so the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following it, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now, therefore, Joseph says, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. Joseph interprets the dreams, and God gave him the answer. What happens? It propels Joseph again. Joseph says to Pharaoh, you need to get somebody to fix this. You need to get somebody to plan for this. You need to get somebody who can save for this and plan for all this and organize it. And Pharaoh turns to Joseph. I want you. I want you. And so I want us to see that as we finish, the 3 results God deemed appropriate for Joseph. Here's the first thing we see, and that's a promotion, a very big promotion. Joseph got a promotion. Look at verse 37 of chapter 41. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and the eyes of all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, as Joseph, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt, from prisoner to prime minister. A promotion. He's overseer of the most powerful nation in the world at that time. He is made prime minister. Right now, maybe you feel you need a promotion. I'm not talking about at work. You'll have to deal with that with your boss. I'm talking about in life. Listen, you already have a promotion. At your salvation, God made you a child of His. You're His child. You've been promoted. You've been lifted up. You are His and have all the access, all the strength that you need to run your life. God has given that to you. Then Joseph got a power. He got a power given to him. Look at verse 42. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. And so Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, and he went through all the land of Egypt. He's given a new name. A new name, a little harder to pronounce than Joseph. But it means this: the God who speaks and lives. Pharaoh is saying to Joseph, to me, God has sent you. God speaks to you. God's alive.